Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. And this is the ThieAudio Elixir. This is ThieAudio's latest IM. It's a single dynamic driver IM. And as far as I know, this is ThieAudio's first and only single dynamic driver IM, which is interesting. They're calling it a three-dimensional velocity transducer, which frankly sounds like something Alex Jones warned us about. But given the price, it's around 210 bucks. And the driver configuration, single dynamic driver earphone, the Elixir that we've got here is coming in kind of hot against some obvious competitors, the Moondrop KATO, the Tangent Hana, the Dunu Falcon Pro, right? These are all single dynamic driver earphones I reviewed last year. Now we've got ThieAudio's entry into it, and I am curious to see how it stacks up. Now, what I can say up front, one of the big differentiators here, which we'll talk more about, is the tuning, okay? Where those other three competitors I described are all kind of different flavors of a mild V-shaped sound signature. The Elixir that we've got here, I would describe this as basically neutral. Now, there are different flavors of neutral, and again, we'll get into that in this review, but that's what kind of separates the ThieAudio Elixir. Now, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're here now live, you're watching, you have any questions about the Elixir, anything else we talk about, leave it in the live chat. At the end of the review, get through like 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. At the end of the review, we'll have a little bit of a back and forth conversation, hopefully answer all of your burning questions. But otherwise, if you're interested in checking out the ThieAudio Elixir, shout out to Linsol for sending this in for review. There is a link to them down in the description below. But more to the point, let's dive to the table and start talking about the build and the physical stuff of this IM as I knock it around my table. Before we start talking about the sound, we'll get to the sound, don't worry. But quick tour of the packaging, very, very simple ThieAudio box. I actually don't even know if this is official retail packaging because it's so simple and bare bones, but I don't know. I'm not mad at it. But what you get inside the box is also fairly simple. You do get a nice little carry case. There's some other IMs, like there's some Moondrop IMs that have come with a carry case like this, and I tend to like this because it's small enough to fit in a pocket. It's got a magnetic clasp on it, but it's also not so big and bulky that I would never use it. So shout out to them for that. The sets of tips that you get, I guess I'll pull these things into view briefly, but you do get a full set of foam tips as well as a full set of silicone tips. And the silicone tips, actually, I don't know, they're mostly not that notable. But what is maybe a little bit notable is that these are a little on the small side. So you might notice that typically I will use medium-sized ear tips, but here I've actually opted to go for their large ones. But it is nice that in the foam sizes, they've actually got them in all large, medium, and small. But yeah, that does it for what comes inside the box of this IM. So let's go ahead and talk about the cable and the earpieces, starting with, of course, the cable. And I will say that this is, again, a very simple, straight to the point cable. But I think I like it, you know? It's not especially flashy. Just got your simple 2-core wind. Maybe wind is the noun version of that word. But yeah, you got your 2-core wind. You've got a very slim Y split up here, a functional chin cinch. This thing actually stays in place, which I appreciate. And then of course you've got your pre-foamed ear hooks and your 2-pin connectors. What's maybe notable about this cable is it's actually pretty soft. And it's interesting that this cable design, I feel like I've got this with like almost the exact same cable with the last 3 IMs that I've had, but they all have kind of a different texture to it, right? A different handling ability. And this one is nice and soft, and you can see as I rotary wrap it, it's quite tighty. I dig this cable. Again, simple, no fuss. But that's going to bring us into talking about the earpieces themselves, which I guess we'll start with the aesthetics stuff. And as I'm talking about the aesthetics, I think it's worth pulling up both of these earpieces because they've actually got somewhat of a different aesthetic. The material that ThieAudio is using here, let's see if I can get a little bit of not glare on there. The material that Thie is using here is actually a little bit random. So the pattern that you see here on mine, if you buy these, are probably not going to be the exact same as mine because it seems to be some sort of, I don't know if it's a natural material or just somehow otherwise randomized, but it's an interesting look. What I will say is that over here on this earpiece, this is my left side, this one almost kind of looks like a wood material or something like that. A little marbly, but there you go. And then on this side, you could almost say this one looks a little bit haunted. And I don't know if that's going to come across totally on camera here, but yeah, I've seen a number of these earpieces from other people, and it's just kind of interesting finding patterns inside them that you may or may not notice. So does that look like the trapped soul of a haunted face? Maybe, again, one of those things that Alex Jones was warning us about. Does that look like that to anybody else, or is that just me? It might just be me. But it's not just me, because I know the folks on the Discord server, we were talking about it. But yeah, that's the aesthetic stuff, or at least the external pattern. Otherwise, I don't know, you've got kind of like this gold rim around the outside, and the shells are otherwise black on the back. They are somewhat, semi-custom molded, but for the most part, this is a pretty typical shape for a single dynamic driver earphone, which has both its strengths and weaknesses, as I guess now talk about the ergonomics of this IM. And I say this kind of stuff almost all the time about single dynamic drivers, that they tend to not have the most custom molded, fitted fit. The plus side is that they're probably going to work for most people's ears, whereas some of the more semi-custom stuff might be a little bit trickier. So these will probably fit your ear. The downside is that the fit security is not the best. So you can see it, right? The ingress, egress, great. Comfort level, I would say, on these things, perfectly fine. Had no issues with the comfort. Like, I don't feel any edges or anything like that. And you can see that in my ear, it's not especially large or anything like that. I would say this is a medium-sized single dynamic driver earphone, as you would expect. Now, where I was saying it's maybe a little bit weak, and this is again true of pretty much every single dynamic driver earphone out there, is that the fit security is not the best. So that just means that as I'm talking, as I'm chewing, which are not things I do a lot when I'm listening to music, but you can imagine doing other things like that, it can start to come loose over time, and I just have to reach back over here, refit it. As I'm doing this, maybe also worth calling out that there is a little bit of driver flex that I get, but I only really get over here on the left side, so I haven't seen anyone else talking about that, so I don't know how big of an issue that is, and for me it's not such a big issue, but something worth knowing about out there is that it does have a little bit of dynamic driver flex to it, but I think that's going to do about everything we can say about the physical stuff. So without further ado, let's talk about the sound. And like I typically do, we'll start by talking about the general sound signature as I lay this thing out for you to enjoy, Uncle Thie, as we've affectionately called him. Yeah, let's just talk about the general sound signature first, and then I'll get into talking about what I like and maybe what are some of the things I don't love. Sound signature on this, as I already alluded to in the intro, is basically a flavor of neutral. Like, you could look at the frequency response of this and just call it neutral. Whereas some of the other single dynamic drivers I've talked about, I'd say there are various forms of mild V-shape, mostly natural sounding, but still mild V-shape. This one, I think, still falls into the land of neutral. Now, there is still, I would say, a bit of bass emphasis, which we'll talk a little bit more in a bit. But yeah, there is a little bit of bass emphasis, and up top in the treble, I would say it's actually a little bit on the dark side. So those two things combined, right? A mild bass boost and a mild sort of darkness in the treble kind of give this thing a bit of a warm tilt to that neutral tune. You could say, honestly, like, this kind of reminds me a lot of some of Etymotic's warmer tuned IMs. Some things like the Etymotic ER2 XR and even like the Eti Evo. But of course, you don't have the deep fit of the Etymotics. And frankly, like, I don't think these are quite as sterile as the Etymotics. These are still a little bit more fun because of that, a little bit extra bass there. So let's go ahead and dive into now talking about what are the things that I like here on the sound of the Elixir. So just generally, that tune, I like a neutral tune, I like a mid-range focused sound. The Elixir delivers on that, so I like that a lot. I think it's a very mature tune. It's restrained, it's polite, it's a bit sturdy, it's not like a thin sound. But like I said, versus the Etymotics, it's actually a little bit more fun. So it's not like a boring version of neutral. Let's see, what was I saying? The neutral like this in general has kind of been the realm of Etymotic, which has the very big caveat of not everyone wants to wear an Etymotic. We'll show you why in a little bit. But also there was like the Dunu Zen Pro, which this reminds me a lot of in its tuning, but that's a $900 IM. So at $210, certainly not a cheap IM, but given what's out there, what this thing's up against, it's actually a little bit standout in that sense. Now, other things I like about this treble, I did mention it being a little bit on the dark side, but the side effect of that is that it's really never strident. It's never It's never fatiguing at all. It does even extend pretty well, and you really just get no issues with sibilance, no sharpness, but you do still get, you know, a nice timbre on sort of that high frequency percussion stuff like hi-hats and cymbals and stuff like that, right? Listening to, it's a bit cliche at this point, but Fleetwood Mac, right? Their recordings are awesome, and their hi-hat percussion on certain sets, if the treble rolls off too early, you hear that it just doesn't sound like nice and weighty. Here, the ThieAudio Elixir does it quite well. I also talked about there being a little bit of a bass bump on this thing. I think it's very, very tasteful. It's mostly in the sub bass, but it's not entirely sub bass focused like, I don't know, like your typical Harman tune. There's a smidge of mid bass in there, but it's mostly sub bass, right? So it's not going to be smearing up the mid range or really compromising the mid range at all because of how mild it is, but it is there, and it's going to keep it nice and fun. And just overall, you know, I think it is a very clean and mature sound for a set in this price range. Now, that's what I like about this thing. What are the things that I don't like about it? And we'll say right up front, there's not a lot, but there are some things. So what I don't love about the sound of the Elixir, like I mentioned, it's a neutral tune, right? And that might not be for everybody. This is just a warning for anyone out there who has never really listened to something neutral. You're mostly used to, you know, budget KZs and maybe even budget Moondrop stuff. And you're used to a bassy set. This is going to be a little bit more on the reserved side. I think this is a set that it will do well with pretty much any music, but the better sounding your music is going to really bring out the excitement in a set like this. Whereas if you're listening to stuff that's not mastered that particularly well, this set is not going to impart a bunch of excitement on it the way that something like a Tantrum Hana might. So there you go. Maybe more to my preferences, more to a critique of my own, is I do think that this is tonally a tad on the dark side. The treble is just a little bit reserved for my taste. It does, again, I mentioned it reminds me of the Etymotic Evo. Listening to this thing, like immediately, that was like that character, the warm tilt plus the slightly dark treble presentation. This really did remind me a lot about the Evo, and I do think that lack of treble sharpness does impede the technicals a little bit. So the treble can sometimes lack a little bit of incisiveness, I suppose. Mid-range maybe comes across a tad smoothed over here on the Elixir, and this is just, you know, in comparison to some other stuff, which we'll talk about a little bit. The bass attack on this, I think, is actually pretty well defined, but it's not entirely sharp, which again, we'll talk about how this thing compares to some other stuff. But really, despite all that, I think the Elixir does have a generally good sense of layering. Just don't expect like standout imaging chops. So those are my general thoughts here on the ThieAudio Elixir. But as I was alluding to, we gotta bring in some competitors and talk about how this thing stacks up directly against them. So let's do that. Let's move this stuff to the side and make room for a handful of IMs that we will compare. All right, ThieAudio Elixir, $210 single dynamic driver earphone. Moondrop KATO, $190, I believe, also single dynamic driver earphone. Pull in the old faithful JVC FDX1. This one might not even be manufactured anymore, so I don't know how useful this comparison will be, but $250, also single dynamic driver earphone. I brought this one in for its tuning. And then finally, I actually thought it would be worth pulling in the Etymotic ER2XR, also a single dynamic driver earphone. Price on this varies depending on where you are in the world. I almost said country. If you're in the US, you can get this for like under $100 easy. Outside of the US, it's probably around 100, 150 bucks. But there you go. Those are our competitors, all single dynamic driver earphones, all roughly priced similarly, although you can see there is a bit of a spread. But let's talk about how these things compare. So in terms of tonality, just the tuning differences, right? The Elixir, I just already talked about this thing. This is neutral, slightly on the dark side with a slight bit of bass boost, gives this kind of a warm tilt to it. But overall, I would call this a neutral sound signature. Whereas here on the KATO, again, as I was alluding to, I would describe this as a mild V-shaped sound signature. So you have a little bit more emphasis in sort of the mid to lower treble, frankly. A little bit more emphasis in the mid bass, especially. And because of that, I don't know, it comes at the expense slightly of the mid-range presentation. This just becomes a little bit more of a dynamic sounding set because of those emphases in the bass and the treble. But the mid bass character that you get here honestly just never really smears up or impedes the detail perception of the rest of the sound. It's quite well done. We'll talk about the technicalities in a bit. The JVC FDX1, this one's the most different of the bunch here. So this is, I would describe as a neutral as well. And I think these are all flavors of neutral, but I think it's worth talking about the different flavors. The FDX1 I would describe as a lean neutral. I would say that this is the one that is the brightest sounding of the bunch, the strongest mid-range focus, the strongest vocal focus, with the least bass, okay? And just in terms of outright bass volume, this is pretty lean here on the FDX1, and that does have swappable nozzles, but they don't really affect the bass. I mean, they'll affect your perception of the bass, but they mostly affect the top end, and so that's why this is very much a lean neutral sound signature. Whereas here on the Etymotic ER2XR, you could just call this one neutral, maybe a smidge on the warm side because it does have a bit of a bass boost to it as well. But if I were like, this is not going to be necessarily a ranking, just kind of to illustrate the differences between these in terms of their tuning. I would say this is kind of like the order of operations, right? You're talking, lean, neutral, lean, bright, neutral. This is a little bit on the warmer side. It's quite a bit warmer than that. This is a step warmer than the ER2, and then the Kato is just square into mild V-shaped sound signature. So that's like kind of your evolution of tonalities. Let's talk about technicalities now. All right, we'll start with the Elixir, which again we've already described a little bit, but just a bit of a recap. Its critique, or my critique of it, is that maybe it lacks a little bit of a bite, and part of that comes because of, I think, the somewhat dark treble, and mostly that comes out when directly comparing it versus the Kato, which is pretty standout. So we'll talk about that, but you do really get pretty decent sense of air and definition on the Elixir. It's just maybe slightly shy of impressive. Whereas here in the Kato, I think this is a really impressive technical set, especially for under $200 single dynamic driver. Really quite good. So you get, I think, a more incisive treble here. You just get a stronger sense of weight to, guitar plucks, and even like those hi-hats and stuff like that. I think you get, you just get stronger definition there in the top end. Again, without it being harsh or sibilant really at all ever. Pretty impressive. The bass on the Kato I also think is pretty standout. Like you get this really good sense of physicality. I mean, there's some physicality here in the Elixir, don't get me wrong, but I think it is pretty next level here, especially in like the attack on the bass. Really, really pretty impressive. Now the JVC FDX1 has kind of its own sense of a strengths, and like the technicalities are honestly why I still love this set. The tuning, a lean neutral, that's certainly going to play to my taste to some degree. But if I'm being perfectly honest, the tuning on this is getting a little bit long in the tooth, and maybe it's just as my preferences shift a little bit, but the technical performance here on the FDX1 still really does keep me coming back to it. And mostly it's just like the mid-range resolution, the sense of texture in vocals. It's really pretty standout here. The treble is also really good quality here. Never sharp or sibilant or harsh or anything like that. It's nice and smooth, and you still get kind of that razor's edge sort of sense of detail without the razor's edge sense of sharpness. I don't know. That was a weird collection of words, but hopefully you understand. I think that the treble performance and the mid-range on this is really standout. And then the bass even, this is the bass lightest of the bunch, but I actually think that the bass quality on this is actually, it's up there. I think this is probably the best bass quality. This is pretty close behind. You get a really surprisingly good sense of physicality behind the bass on the FDX1, despite the fact that it's fairly bass light, and that honestly, in my mind, it makes up for the fact that it's a little bit bass light. And then the Etymotic ER2XR, which every time I say that, I feel like I'm a Star Wars character or something like that. But what this thing I think does stand out in the technical performance is the mid-range texture. In the bass, I would say it's maybe a little bit on the thuddy side. It's not the best bass, but it's also not bad. It's mostly sub-bass focused, but it's just maybe a little bit blurred in sort of the attack on the bass hits. And then the treble, I would also say that the treble has got a little bit of a soft quality versus like the Etymotic ER4, which has got a lot more incisive treble, also has more incisive treble. I would say it's a little bit soft there. So that's how they all compare in terms of technicalities. Let's now just talk briefly about how they compare in terms of form factor. Some of this you can make up your own mind as you look at them. But the Elixir, all right, it's got this this look about it, which you might love this. I gotta say, I don't love the look. I think it's, you know, it's well made. It's all metal. It's a well made shell, but it's I don't know. It's not my favorite look. I'll just leave it at that. I do like the cable quite a bit. And the fit, it's about as good as most single dynamic driver sets. The Kato, I think the Kato looks fantastic. It's got, let's see, punch into that in case you've never seen a Kato before. It's got this mirrored finish, which I like the matte version that they have out there a little bit better because this one's a fingerprint magnet, as you might see. But I do quite like the look of it. The cable on this thing is also pretty standout. And the fit is basically a single dynamic driver. Same I've said for this set. Basically this. Very comfortable, easy to wear, but fit security is not necessarily its strong suit. The FDX1 has also got a pretty unique aesthetic about it. Like, this is a look that kind of only JVC does. And some things about this, I don't know, I've grown to appreciate this a little bit more over time. I think maybe just because it is so unique looking, I think it's pretty cool. It's also got this gimmick where, I don't know if you can see this, but the nozzle actually rotates. I wish it didn't. That does mean that you can wear this thing over ear or hanging down. That's the one. Actually, both of these you can do that. But versus these are only going to be worn over ear. This one you can wear over ear or hanging down to your preference. I prefer to wear it over ear because that helps with the fit stability. And like the other single dynamics, I would say that the fit security here in the FDX1 is not its strength, but you know, it's actually helped out quite a bit with spring tips. And then finally, the Etymotic ER2 XR. Aesthetically, I would say this is the simplest and certainly the most utilitarian of the bunch. It is just a cylinder, and in fact, when you're wearing it, you're not going to see much of the cylinder because pretty much this entire thing goes inside your ear, which is the real big thing to keep in mind with Etymotic. Now, what I will say about Etymotic fit, I actually think it's not as uncomfortable as a lot of people make it out to be. I find Etymotics to be perfectly comfortable. They just take a little bit of adjusting to if you haven't worn them before. For me, the biggest issue with Etymotic's fit is actually more about the ingress and the egress. So putting it into your ear and taking it out. It's got these 3 flanges and they are a little bit on the grippy side. So there's some friction and you get really good isolation out of it because of that. And also excellent fit security, which none of these really do that well. But the cost of it is that it just becomes, I don't want to say painful, but slightly uncomfortable to take these things out of your ear and put them back in. And if that's a thing that you're only doing once, you're getting on like a transatlantic flight and you just want to stick them in and not worry about it, you're fine. But if you're like in an office situation, you need to take them in and out of your ears all the time. That is it's honestly a reason why I don't use these that much, is for that purpose. But I think that's going to do it for the comparisons here between all these single dynamic driver sets. Let's turn our attention back to the Elixir. I haven't rated it yet, so let's do that now. Out of 5 stars, the ThieAudio Elixir, I'm going to give it very, very solid 4 stars. I think this is an excellent set. Not in love with the aesthetic, but you can get over that. It's in my ears. I don't see it. I'm fine with that. Comfortable, it is. Cable, quite like it. And then the sound signature on this is Etymotic-like, but without that Etymotic fit that I just was kind of complaining about. Again, Etymotic fit doesn't bother me too much in terms of comfort. It's just that ingress egress, which you don't have to worry about at all here with the Thie. So yeah, honestly, like having that kind of sound signature at around $200 without that caveat of you might not like the Ety fit, I think that actually makes this a pretty exciting set. You just gotta, weigh it up against the competitors at this price range and think about what kind of sound signature do you want? Do you want something that's more exciting, more incisive, and like engaging dynamically like the Kato, or do you want something that's a little bit more tonally balanced, a little bit more mid-range focus, and give you a little bit better presentation of the vocals, which is what the Elixir probably do for you. So that's going to do it for my review. If you're interested in checking out the Elixir, I do have links in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, you liked it, you're having a good time, you're enjoying your 3-day weekend like I am, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and then YouTube will ostensibly let you know next time I'm live. And if it doesn't, actually maybe join the Discord server, which I also have linked down below, and I forget to call that out. I have a Discord server where I also will announce these videos ahead of them being live, and I've heard that that's actually a little bit more reliable than the YouTube bell. But otherwise, I will catch you on the next super review, unless you're here live with me now, in which case hang out and let's chat.